And we're live. Welcome back to The Future of. I'm your host, Jonathon Narvey. And today, once again, I have Kathy Shaidle joining us, the film columnist for Steyn Online. You can check out her columns, Shaidle at the Cinema, steynonline.com. So I'm so excited to be talking about, once again, the future of culture and politics. We have a lot to talk about today, and we're going to be talking about politics and culture through the lens of film, but not exclusively through that. Kathy, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me back.
Just for those who didn't listen to our previous conversation, or may be a little unfamiliar with your work, can you give sort of a Coles Notes version of who you are?
Sure. Let's see. I started blogging before blogging was a thing back in 2000, and I've written for a variety of publications like Tacky Mag. I used to write for Front Page, many places. And Mark Steyn, the great author and broadcaster, he and I sort of became friendly during the whole human rights tribunal mess that we had going on in Canada about 10 years ago. And I started writing movie columns at his behest over at his website about a year and a half ago. And so every Saturday I have a new one. And that's really the main thing I'm working on these days.
Very good, very good. Not to get into too much detail on that, but as I recall, Mark emerged very much victorious in that landmark legal battle. So
he really did. It was a costly fight for Maclean's. I think it was $2 million in legal fees. Whereas, of course, the plaintiffs get all their legal fees paid by you and me, by our taxes. So that was exciting.
Once again, the intersection of culture and politics. Okay.
That's right.
So our topics today, we have a few different things I want to get into with you. The first one relates to your column about I Shot Andy Warhol. And I'm sad to say I haven't seen the movie yet, but I did watch the trailer and several of the videos that you included in your review. And number one, I was amazed that I haven't seen this movie because it seems like something I would definitely want to see. So if it's on Netflix and I haven't seen it, that's my bad. The other thing is I think you just made such a great point about you kicked off. I guess it's a little bit of a weird thing for me to be reading your words when it's your words.
Go ahead
here, but yeah, the thing that makes this film timely. I'm just going to read a bit of the introduction of your column, I Shot Andy Warhol.
Sure.
So let's see. I don't spend a lot of time at the New York Times except for the crosswords, but was prompted to visit late last week by David Iowa Hawk Burge, who tweeted, "It's a tragedy that her important treatise calling for all men to be killed has been overshadowed just because she attempted to kill a man." And this was in reference to Valerie Solanas, who the New York Times provided an obituary, and this person was as you've noted, the author of the Scum Manifesto, the Society for Cutting Up Men. And you've written, notably, many New York Times commentators expressed disgust and dismay at the paper's decision to memorialize Solanas. Who's next? Charles Manson was a common refrain. So I think this column delves into not just the film, but the surrounding culture around it. So I'd like your thoughts on what is the what do we learn from not just the film itself, but the what people have taken from it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm I what happened was the New York Times decided during Pride Month, because it's a month now, to do belated obituaries of, I guess you could say, gay people who should have been famous, or who were forgotten when they did die. So here's an obit now, 30 years later or whatever. And
Mm,
I was amazed that people who read the New York Times were incredibly offended that, they would do an obituary for the woman who tried to kill Andy Warhol. And that's really what Valerie Solanas is probably most famous for, although the Scum Manifesto is still in print and is read by radical feminists and curious people to this day. And the movie does not really set out to glorify her. Um, but my complaint, and it's kind of a stupid complaint, is that the woman in the lead role is so good that and I'm sure that she's far more attractive and charismatic than the real Valerie Solanas, that I'm concerned that people who watch it will say, hey, this Valerie Solanas, she wasn't so bad, because that's what happens when you put something on screen. Even if you put something terrible on screen, you are sort of implicitly glamorizing it, no matter how bad it is. And so that was one concern. But I mean, as a film, especially as a first film, I have to give the director credit. She managed to do a really good job.
mm,
Um, but it's one of those things. I mean, the 60s and 70s were a really busy time,
mm,
so busy that people can actually forget that someone almost shot Andy Warhol. It's kind of like today. Today, living in 2020 is like living in the 70s. Every day there's some damn thing going on, and it gets exhausting after a while. But yeah, so I remembered the film. I decided to rewatch it and write about it, basically based on that sort of bizarre obit. And what I thought was the kind of hopeful sight of New York Times readers actually being appalled by something.
mm, mm. There's some interesting things that you touched on there. Number one, your observation that yes, the actor who or actress who plays the role. Yeah, as I said, only watched the trailers, and I was struck that just in those scenes that I watched, it was a very compelling performance. I was drawn in, and I wanted more. And I think you've noted in the piece, she's not a sexy woman, but she has a certain seductive quality about her. It's just this person is extremely interesting, and
Yes.
and I think that's you know. I guess it is a credit to the filmmakers. I have no idea what this person was like in real life, but the best villains are not sort of cookie cutter evil for the sake of evil folks, and of course she's not the villain of the piece. I suppose she's more the anti-hero of the piece, although
That's very true. Yeah.
yeah.
Um, and when you're watching it, and I guess if you're female and you're in a certain really bad mood, you can read the Scum Manifesto and kind of find yourself going, well, yeah, especially if you consider women's role at the time.
Mm,
It's not that she didn't raise some valid points, but then to just go off and, I mean, she clearly had untreated mental illness, which, as I said in the piece, um, what a shock considering her really unpleasant childhood. And in those days, I don't know how far things have progressed, but when the big advances in psychiatry were things like lobotomy and electroshock, it's probably no surprise that she ended up not getting any better. So her paranoia eventually got the better of her. She concocted a bizarre idea in her head that Andy Warhol had stolen some of her ideas, and she was going to get him. And it's very sad, and you know, it's kind of a human tragedy. I'm not
Mm.
saying I have a lot of sympathy for her, um, but you know that it was just another day in the 70s.
Mm. As an aside, I can't imagine. I mean, I'm not a licensed psychiatrist or anything like that, but I just can't imagine how electroshock therapy would be used to treat someone's paranoia. You know, being tied down to a table and subjected to electric shocks. I gotta say that would make me a little less trusting of my fellow human beings, but there must be some kind of a methodology to their madness.
I think it's actually making a comeback because, as you can imagine, it's not as primitive as it used to be. And so I'm not an expert on that either, but there are people who say that, you know, used properly, it can be helpful to a small number of people. But that's the problem with trends in medicine or in anything. You know, yesterday's cutting edge, you know, oh, how were we to know it would be so terrible? You know, we look back and think about how bad it was, but at the time that was what was cutting edge, and it's kind of important to realize that when
Mm.
people say the science is settled, sometimes maybe it isn't and it shouldn't be.
Right. Yeah. Well, interestingly, I think I mentioned Douglas Murray in our last podcast. He had a line about this, I guess, from an opposite take, not about electroshock therapy, but this was in relation to the idea of giving testosterone to 4 or 5 year olds, or you know, essentially, and designating young children as trans. And he apparently had been talking with his editor, and his editor had a line something like, you know, in every generation, you know, you'll look back and you'll think, what were they thinking? What
Exactly.
madness was? And so the thing to think about, the next thing to think about is, what is it that we are doing that is that the generation of the future will say about us? What were they thinking?
Well, I
Um,
like to think that people will look back and say that about the trans movement, but I have a feeling that that's not really going to happen, that it's just going to become uh, common knowledge. Oh, of course, this is great,
mm,
because I think the balance of power has shifted in terms of opinion and who decides, you know, who writes history and
mm,
who decides what is real and not real.
mm.
So as much as I'd like to say, oh yeah, everyone's going to look back at X and laugh, I'm not 100% convinced of that. So
Mm.
I'm gonna have a wait and see attitude about that one.
I think that is a fair-minded attitude to that. I am a little bit more optimistic, and maybe it's just because I've been listening to a number of podcasts that they're not exclusively dedicated to this topic, but I've noted a few trends. Number one, lawsuits seem to be in the
Yes.
offing,
Yep.
and you know, just the consequences of early treatments, changing the chemistry in young people's bodies, making them infertile, rendering their genitalia, you know, they'll never, you know, uh, you'll have boys who are stuck with evidently small penises and for their entire lives.
Yep.
And you know, who knows what kind of mental consequences going on. So it may be that the reality of the situation just overwhelms the ideology at some point, but we'll see.
I hope so.
Mm, mm. So sorry, that was a bit of a tangent, somewhat related. I wanted to just sort of close the loop on this talk about I Shot Andy Warhol with you. You mentioned that a few times that we're living in the 70s. can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I just remember being a kid in the 70s, and every day there was some horrible thing going on, like every single day. Hijackings were a huge deal back then, and Patty Hearst being kidnapped, and Watergate, all kinds of environmental freakouts going on. And a guy has a book out now. One of my hobby horses is the Hat Riots, which is finally getting some attention. And that was the day after Kent State. It's rather cinematic, actually. A bunch of hippies went down to Wall Street to protest the Kent State shootings and were met with the very angry, hard-hatted guys who were then working, ironically, on the World Trade Center. And a huge riot broke out, which was almost disappeared by the mainstream media. But I happen to know a guy, a now ex-communist, who was the photographer there, and he has a lot of photographs of it. And in today's social media, of course, that would be everywhere. But because even then the liberals controlled the media, they didn't really want to show hippies being defeated by these hard hat guys, and it was an embarrassment, so it got covered up. And that was like a day. It lasted maybe a day or two. And you think about, it was 68, but the Democratic National Convention, and the 70s were a very colorful time, and in insofar as things like the news, and it got really overwhelming. I think as a kid I was very overwhelmed, but even the adults were. And the oil crisis, gas prices, inflation, Jimmy Carter, just a gigantic kaleidoscope of awful every single day. And 2020 really reminds me of that. I feel sorry for kids who are trying to make sense of all the crazy
Mm.
that they see in front of them.
Yes. Well, 2 points. First, as you said, it's I don't know if that it's history repeating. It's I'm sure you would agree, or I think you would agree. History repeats, but not always quite in the same way. It's never
Right.
quite the same. So, where you had hippies versus construction workers. I think it was last year, or maybe it was this year. I can't remember. Gavin McInnes, the Proud Boys versus Antifa,
Right.
and just for those who have no idea what that's about, it's essentially Antifa had been threatening some kind of a dust up, and were I understand actively hunting for Proud Boys. And chucking bottles of urine at them, and starting a fight. They got their asses kicked,
Yeah.
and none of the Antifa folks were ever charged, I don't think, but I believe several of the Proud Boys in that altercation went to jail for several years.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and you also talked about the bias of the media. I think, just to touch on that briefly, I think some listeners may have an understanding that, if anything, look, newspapers, magazines, radio, TV, these are all companies, corporations. They're clearly right wing because they're about making money. That's sort of the surface level of it. Or if they've done any kind of research, very surface level, they might think, maybe it's a 50-50 split. But to those folks, I would say, just sort of name a newspaper that, or a media outlet that isn't Fox News or the Wall Street Journal. Or of course Rebel, which most of them won't. Most folks are sort of conflicted about. Like I consider it obviously news media, but a lot of folks in Canada and the U.S. would just be like, this is. It's not news. It's something. So
Right.
it's its own category. So I don't want to get into that whole tangent, but for those who think that there is a right-wing bias and not an overwhelming left-wing bias in the media, as a PR professional who deals with reporters every day, I can tell you the default setting is left.
Well, it is, but they think they're moderates.
Mm.
Like that's the thing that always gets me is that if you ask them, they'll say, "Oh, I'm a middle of the road kind of guy," because of course they think that because all their friends are the same, so they figure they must be middle of the road.
Mm.
How can I be a radical or a leftist if everyone I know, like that is the anti-definition of fringe, everyone
Mm-hmm.
I know. Um, so I think that their bubble prevents them sometimes from being brutally honest.
Mm.
And and it makes me think of the whole Liberal Party. I mean, Canadian values, like to them, it's just taken as given that immigration is good, multiculturalism is good, diversity is good. The idea of saying any of those things aren't is like saying the earth is flat. Like they cannot um, wrap their minds around that, or the idea that there are people who don't agree with that, or that there are people who don't agree with that who are intelligent.
Mm.
So yeah, I think when you're always talking to yourself in your bubble, and this can happen on the right too, but the right, as you say, aren't the people who are running everything. I get a kick like you do out of the Fox News people. Yes, and you know, okay, Fox and they never have an answer.
um, so good, so good. We could record an entire other episode about just media bias, but I did want to get into your other column, Pontypool. Um, and I this is I'm embarrassed to say this is another film that I haven't seen yet, but
Well, it is
I've been
Canadian, so that's going to happen, right?
well, the thing is, I was actually aware of it when it came out, but maybe because it was Canadian, it had limited distribution in theaters, so I didn't see it at the time it came out, and then I just sort of, I was actually looking for it on Netflix last week because I wanted to prepare, and instead I was reduced to just checking out the trailers again. The reason for my interest. Yes, number one, it was Canadian, but that's not necessarily a reason to watch it. I'm sure not every American wants to watch every single American film.
Right.
The But I am a big fan of zombie movies and zombie TV shows. So it caught my interest at the time. That I guess like this is way before Walking Dead came out. So I was a fan of like the Night of the Living Dead and that series. Um, so, anyways, the movie itself is actually not just about cannibalistic zombies. In fact, I don't even know if they're cannibalistic. Well, why don't you tell me a bit about the film and what it means?
Well, what it means, you'd have to get Tony on the writer to maybe give his idea of what it means. But Tony Burgess, not to be confused with Anthony Burgess, by the way. Tony Burgess is a Canadian writer, and what happens is it's a very small radio station, the only one in an incredibly small, very isolated, small, snowy Ontario town. And the DJ, who is kind of a Imus knockoff, this is his last gig probably that he's ever going to have because he's been fired from every place else. And they're sort of semi-stranded in this snowed-in little radio station and start getting reports from the weatherman about weird behavior in the town. And I guess to make a long story short, the idea behind the movie is that language is the virus. There's always a virus in a zombie movie, and some guy in a white coat says a bunch of stuff that quote explains it, and it's just an excuse to have the movie. Whereas the theory here is the whole idea of the movie. Is language a virus? And I think, if it had been made today, um, it could be a lot richer. But, I think this idea is an old one. I mean, that gossip is a virus, that it isn't just words, that you're actually doing harm to people and yourself if you gossip about them. William S. Burroughs talked about language being a virus back in, I guess, the 60s or early 70s. So the filmmakers, Tony Burgess, etc., set out to kind of explore this. Can words be contagious? I mean, we look at something like Twitter, and you see how words can escalate into uh, actual fights and a lot of hatred, a lot of, the addiction of saying certain words over and over again, the way that a lot of social justice warriors, um, I think they mood alter by using jargon. And I think people in professions that use a lot of jargon, like businessmen and that, one of the reasons that we can't get rid of that weird business jargon of things like, oh, what's the one that was really big a few years ago? There are always these catchphrases in business that go in and out of fashion. I think it gives people kind of a weird rush to speak that way. Um, Sometimes people mood alter by swearing a lot. It becomes a habit. And again, I think it releases some kind of chemical in the brain that's either soothing or exciting. But for whatever reason, words have a lot of power. And this is what the movie is trying to get at. And it's very low budget, um, almost, experimental theater kind of. Kind of idea. One of the things in the movie that I thought was good, and the filmmakers didn't let themselves explore because being Canadian filmmakers, I'm sure they're men of the left, is that there's a dichotomy between English. The English language is actually the virus, and so people start communicating in French. And I thought that was a wonderful missed opportunity to explore forced bilingualism in Canada. Um, but I would have made French the virus, and English the cure for it, had I made the conservative version of Pontypool. So I think there were almost too many ideas to squeeze into a 90-minute movie, and a lot of them were left unexplored for ideological reasons. But just as sort of a thinking man's horror movie, it's not bad. But a lot of the Canadian stuff, like the bilingualism, would probably be lost on a lot of Americans unless you did a remake and it was Hispanic, and there was some kind of press one for English kind of gag that they could get in there to sort of signal to people, okay, this is what we're going to do. So, interesting, great performance by the lead guy, by everybody, really did a good job.
Mm.
And one of those movies that you watch and you think, oh, it's good, but if only they had
Mm.
done this, if they had done my idea.
Ha!
And
I'm sure that had to do with commercial interest being a factor. Like, already it's starting with a bit of a hurdle, just being a Canadian production, and then switching it over to more of a focus on the French-English divide in Canada, which would have been completely alien, I think, to
yeah,
most U.S. audiences or world audiences. They would have been like, "What is going on here? I have no idea." I suspect that was a factor.
I think you're absolutely right, you know.
Mm,
And so they pulled themselves back.
mm,
And kind of a shame. I think there was a lot of stuff in there that could have been explored, but they wanted to have international distribution, and it does have quite a cult following in the U.S., and
mm,
that probably helps a lot.
mm.
They
I
toned it down.
Yeah. Just a few thoughts on this. Clearly, yeah. I mean, the language as a virus, or language as a vector of viruses,
Right,
or
right.
is maybe better. I'm sure they weren't the first to think of that, but this reminds me of a talk or a podcast. I'm sure Sam Harris has made this point a number of times, but I thought it was funny the way he put it. Something like it was something like, if you were to speak in an auditorium full of, say, 100 people or several hundred people, um, just based on the habits of the human mind, brain chemistry, the how they're feeling that day, whether they're inclined to agree with you in the first place, um, a certain segment of that population in that auditorium is going to hear the exact opposite of what you just said. Uh,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and so, in a sense, if we take the virus to the next logical step, so those, some segment of people you talk to are actually going to be inoculated against your ideas by virtue of listening to you, and may in fact spread their resistance to other people. Um, but I guess, if you manage to spread your ideas or your virus to enough people, maybe you can overcome the resistance. I don't know.
And it's an interesting movie to watch. And the reason I guess I picked it was with the coronavirus. There was an awful lot of information on the web with people looking back at things like the Journal of the Plague year, and writings about different plagues and viruses and epidemics throughout history. And again, language does come into that, in their own, what sounds to us archaic way. A lot of these writers were sort of groping around for a way of explaining how the words that were used to describe it, why they sort of were also contagious and took on a kind of a life of their own.
Mm,
And it's like, the way that everyone is walking around going self-isolating. Well,
mm,
I think that's just called isolating,
hmm,
but it's important to have a new-ish word to feel important, um, to somehow you're trying to, I don't know, not brand what you do, but it's something that I think people will be exploring when they look back at the coronavirus.
mm.
As with a lot of crazes and fads and so on, the invention of unnecessary words to describe something uh, is a phenomenon that I always find really interesting.
That's again, that's another topic we could get into for a whole episode: the invention of new terms, and the mutilation of the English language. I guess tied into this is the relatively new idea. Or I think it's new in the last 3 or 4 years of language as violence.
Oh, yes.
I can't remember who made the point, but it seems logical to me that there is a purpose behind that of simply, um, well, if you think of when you are legitimately allowed to use violence or use any methods at your disposal to destroy anyone in front of you, the number one reason we would all agree to is self-defense. So if words are violence and someone has said something and it's violent, well, in self-defense, you can destroy them
Right.
with no repercussions to you. So if we're all in agreement, then this wave of whether it's actual violence or just doxing of mainly doxing of conservatives, or those seen to be conservative, even if they're not even close to being conservative, they're often just I don't have to name names, but people who would consider themselves to be classical liberals who simply do not sign on to the latest orthodoxy of the left, and their lives are destroyed. jobs are lost, their reputations are hobbled. I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Well, I think that that shows a trajectory that we see a lot in politics. Advocacy groups. I don't know, the Anti-Defamation League or something. Their point, such as it was even 10 years ago, was um, words n- need to be stigmatized and punished because they could lead to violence.
Hmm.
And then that slowly gets whittled down into words are violence. Um, I think mostly because people who are in academia, where it's important to try to come up with new and exciting theories so that you can get your thesis approved, just sort of uh, condense stuff down to its illogical conclusion.
Hmm.
So, we can argue about whether or not certain slurs lead to violence. I can see how that works, but we've allowed it to degenerate to the point where words are violence, which is two different things. But I think you have to have kind of a nimble mind to discern that. And a lot of the people who are in charge don't have very nimble minds. And this has just become, it's easier to say.
Hmm.
It's,
Hmm.
some of it just comes down to, oh, it's so much easier to just say words are violence,
Right.
Um, so, but that kind of intellectual laziness, as we see, is what does cause a lot of violence. The
Hmm.
people who are yelling words are violence are always the most violent people. The people who are, I'm anti-hate, hate pretty much everybody. The anti-fascists are all fascists. So, um, a lot of this is self-delusion on
Hmm.
their part, but
Hmm.
I don't think a lot of self-examination is going to be coming out of people like that anytime soon. Unfortunately, they're all sort of congratulating each other, and when you have companies like powerful companies like Nike and so on adopting your slogans, that just reinforces your beliefs already.
Right. Right. Um, well said. And before we entirely leave the Pontypool and that genre behind, I did want to touch on The Walking Dead because I think we're both fans of the show, and this, I think that show actually, the way it has changed, has some things to say about the culture and where it's gone and where it's going. Um, the I've been a fan of that show since the start, and it's gone undergone a few iterations. Um, Essentially, it started off as a really simple premise, survive a zombie apocalypse, and in the meantime, very early on, it's clear the main threat is actually not so much from zombies but from other human beings. Um, and This is expressed often internally amongst the group in arguments and drama, and even before they're getting into fights with the Walking Dead. So I've watched the trajectory of the show change a little bit. It got very much like very bleak, like The Road, and then I actually thought the show could have ended on a very interesting note, uh, as the survivors make their way into the Alexandria safe zone, and there's I just thought the final episode could be as they're listening to the sound of children behind the walls. They walk in, and you don't quite know what happens to the group, but it carried on. And then there was the season where I gather they lost a lot of viewership because the violence went over the top. And today, uh, the show has changed. I think James Woods had the actor had a comment on Twitter for which he was lambasted, but he's an old guy and he doesn't care anymore, and he's got his money.
No.
So it's like, I don't recall what the tweet said exactly, but it was something like, are they just now stalking this show with every single visible minority oppressed
Yeah.
culture, whatever on the show? Is that what's going on here? And I would include in that um, obese folks who are not a strictly an oppressed minority, but I've just never understood seeing very overweight people in a show about the apocalypse, where clearly getting food is probably not the easiest thing to do. That just seems. I always get this. I break the immersion of the show, and I know I'm watching a TV show when I see a fat person on The Walking Dead.
Well, wasn't there a really fat guy on Lost?
Yes,
Which
yes.
I didn't watch, but all I knew was that there was fat guy on Lost and why.
Yes, well, they actually did explain that.
Oh,
I watched the show. There was this bizarre thing where these mysterious people would be parachuting supplies onto the island, and this fat dude remained fat because he was the guy who kept finding those stalks of peanut butter and cereal and potato chips, and he just
oh.
wouldn't share them with the rest of the group.
But nobody ever said, why are you fat? Like,
They brought it up on the show,
yeah, you would think.
and in fact they tried to help him lose weight, which really shouldn't have been an issue. It should have
No.
just happened naturally. It's like, geez, wow, I guess it really is a glandular problem.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's right.
Anyways, not to pick on overweight people. It's a
No,
cross
but
I
just
don't
in
have
the
to bear.
context of a certain plot line, you have to ask yourself, this seems weird to me.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't know. That was sort of a meandering. I guess the problem is I've been watching the show for 10 years, and I never had anyone to talk about with it. So I just sort of let fly. But if you have any thoughts about the
Well,
show and what it means
it
to the broader culture.
it's my understanding that the sort of multicultural aspect of the show comes from the original comic. So I don't really think I can criticize that. Um, and in fact, I call it my weekly exercise in multiculturalism. I quite enjoy the fact that you know everybody is kind of getting along when they're getting along. And what I used to think was funny, and this is quite a few years ago, was that they did some kind of survey where they said, it turns out that in red states, The Walking Dead is the most popular show. As we all know, this is because it's an allegory about white people killing illegal Mexican immigrants. And I'm like, wow, you have never seen this program, have you? Like, you live, like, talk about living in a bubble. If you believe that that is what the show is about, you live on another planet. Like,
Yeah.
I like, okay, allegories are great, and I'm willing to hear out people and their theories about this is an allegory of something. No, in this case, you are so stupid and bigoted, oh
Yeah.
yes, because I yeah.
No,
I don't think anybody's race has been an issue since that one funny bit where, you know, early Daryl, as opposed to now evolved Daryl, says,
mm.
so are you Chinese or something?
Oh yeah, yeah.
And he goes, I'm Korean. So then 2 episodes later, his crazy brother shows up and goes, who's the Chinese guy? And Daryl says, he gets really puffed up, he's Korean. And like, that was it. I think that was in season 1. It was hilariously funny.
Yeah.
And that was the last time anybody said anything about
Yeah, well, I see this. That's funny because I noticed that with I play video games sometimes. There's a series called Fallout, another post dystopian or post apocalyptic dystopian kind of a setting, and you can choose your character and make them whatever they want, of course. And there's you know people of all racial backgrounds, presumably, and it's just in every iteration of that video game. Yeah, race is not an issue.
No, no one
It's
cares.
nobody cares if you can pick up a gun and defend yourself and defend your friends. We want you on the team.
Now, I don't know where things stand now,
Mm,
because let's face it, attitudes do evolve at a really rapid pace. But
mm,
it's my understanding that in the Walking Dead fandom, like if you go to a convention, they have black people dressed as white characters. They have white characters dressed as black characters. I don't even necessarily mean wearing blackface. I mean just putting the dreads on and I'm the king, right? With a little tiger or something.
right, right, or Morgan.
And
Yeah, okay.
nobody says, is like, I wasn't there. I'm
Mm,
just saying, it
mm,
seems to me that nobody gives a rat's ass about this. Now,
right.
I don't know what conventions are going to be like when everything else opens again. There might be some kind of Black Lives Matter uh, aftershock freak out about people doing this, in which case that would be really too bad, because I thought that was adorable
Mm,
and encouraging, and everyone was having fun.
mm,
I'm sure someone will come along to wreck it if they're not already plotting to do so. But
mm,
yeah, I just so I often get a kick out of what people who don't watch X think
mm,
X is like,
mm.
and how stupid they are. You
Yeah,
know,
I wanted to pick up on a few threads that you left there. Number one, just, you know, with the coronavirus hitting us and we're all locked down, and it's this is, I mean, we're not in apocalyptic times, but this is a you know, fairly uh, I can't say dire, but it's not a happy time for a lot of folks,
right?
and it's the probably one of the unhappiest times in for as long as we can remember. And I sort of thought, well, maybe this is one of those times when humanity pulls together because, okay, we don't have an alien invader threat, but we kind of do in the sense that these are microscopic viruses that are attacking all of us. And let's just, you know, we're all hunkering down together and, you know, let's feel a sense of solidarity, which lasted about 5 minutes
Right.
or the racial uh, how do I put it, the civil unrest and protests over um, you know, supposed white supremacism, and like this all kicked off seemingly out of nowhere. Well, not exactly. I mean, there have been many people making the argument. I won't say making the case, but making maybe making the claim that there is systemic racism in our society. I'm so you know, people will accuse me of, you know, being you know, denying that there's a problem. Well, obviously you are part of the problem, but you know, I saw growing up, we had almost achieved that that sense that they had in The Walking Dead and in Fallout, and you know, of nobody cares about this stuff. Can we get on with
I know.
other stuff? And it's such a distraction. It's something. Like the number of cycles in people's brains that people are devoting to this nonsense. Like if you look at the data of for instance, you know, that with the slaying of George Floyd by that psychopath. Well, actually, I don't even know, because I read parts of the transcript, which I'm, you know, the of the arresting officers with Floyd, um, and it's like, it's not like they're making racial slurs, or that like they seemed like they wanted to get him into the car to arrest him for that stupid counterfeiting thing, and probably straight up murdering the guy in front of cameras was not something that was they were intending to do. But I don't know. Anyways, the point is, you know, this has set off a you know, countless claims of, oh, there's systemic racism in the cops and the government and the whole structure of society. And it's like, okay, well, look at here's one data point, just the number of, say, Black people who are killed by cops who are unarmed every year in the States. I think it's something like 19 last year,
Right.
which you would think from all the coverage that this is something that's happening every day, and we're talking thousands, and it's and literally every time a cop looks at a person of color, they are looking around to see if there's any witnesses, to see if they can just straight up murder people. Um, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but this is it's been weighing a lot on my mind.
Well, I think if the left didn't have exaggeration, they wouldn't have much. It's the
Mm,
same with COVID. I'm not saying that people weren't dying of COVID, but most of them were in their 80s. And, I think the other day, the BC figures were one person under the age of 47. Um, the average age was 85. I mean, the average age that you live in BC isn't even 85, and for this, we're actually locking down the whole country. But they love a crisis because it gets them very excited and gets them money and things like that. So there always has to be an exaggeration. You see it with climate change. Um, and the sad part is that it works. I mean, it works in the sense that Al Gore's movie has now brainwashed millions of kids into thinking that polar bears are going extinct and the world is on fire and so forth. And,
mm,
because they own the means of production. They own the means of media and educational production and things like that. So
mm,
this has been and I write about this a lot in my columns, actually, when it's relevant, of, you know, the junk science that has brought us to where we are today. Um, you know, I I've heard other similar anecdotes, but just like my personal one was, I had a male hairdresser, and he was straight, but the salon was in at Church and Wellesley, which is Boys Town in Toronto. And we got to talking, and I said something like, so what percentage of the population do you think is gay? And he said, oh, 30. And I've heard people tell similar stories. I mean,
Yeah,
and you say, well, actually, it's maybe 5. And they will not believe you, because haven't you watched TV?
right.
Everybody's gay. I put on Murdoch Mysteries for the first time in about a year and a half to find out that the Jewish Aspergery detective is also gay now. You know, everybody's gay on TV.
Mm,
Everybody is trans.
mm,
And so this gives everyone the idea that, this is a huge problem, because they have to totally exaggerate it. And it gets exaggerated in
mm,
fictional media, and then fiction becomes fact. Um, and they need this because they know that the facts don't align with their uh, power tripping
mm,
agenda, really.
mm. So I think this is an excellent place to segue into the final thing I wanted to talk about, which was how conservatives, and I should, you know what, I'll preface this by saying this isn't a conservative podcast,
Right.
but I do have a conservative commentator on the podcast with me right now, so this is the time to get into it. And yes, I do lean, if I was going to lean any way, it would not be leaning left. So
Right.
I'm a business guy.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so anyways, I want to segue to how conservatives have been fighting rather ineffectively against this overwhelming domination of the culture by, I won't call them liberals, by the left. And I won't get into what the distinction is, because yeah, what it
No, I
doesn't
know
matter. Yeah.
yeah. Let's,
Uh,
look, Google Dennis Prager.
yeah, yeah.
He'll tell you.
Very,
He
very
knows
good.
everything.
Perfect. 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 The So, anyways, the two things. Number one, I know you have criticized the conservatives who try to fight back through anonymous accounts online, which I completely agree with. And I know that you also were critical of how conservatives wasted a lot of time, effort, and some resources developing vanity websites,
Mhm.
video sites, blogs, which were not just not effective at
No.
moving the needle in terms of the culture. But and I don't know, I don't recall your thoughts on, moving to, say, other platforms where they would be welcome, as opposed to, say, the main social media channels are essentially cleansing themselves of anything that is not to the to the liking of social justice warriors. So, yeah, I'm curious about how people of that political persuasion can be effective in your mind. What should they be doing?
Well, my old thing has been, they can't kill everybody and they can't fire everybody. And, it sounds paradoxical, but nobody would have to be anonymous online if nobody was anonymous online. And I think that anonymity, especially for conservatives, um, encourages a kind of empty, bellicose, um, let them come to my door, Second Amendment, woo, kind of idiocy that I don't think is particularly helpful. But my main concern as somebody who has always signed their names to things and knows people who sign their names to things, and at the cost of literally millions of dollars out of their own pockets, and also many lost nights of sleep, is that it simply isn't fair to say that you have to be anonymous because you might get fired from your job,
Mm,
but it's fine for Ezra Levant to use his real name and have people harassing his parents, um, and just walking around talking about how brave a small number of people are, and aren't you great? And I wish I could sign my real name, but I can't. If you really want to help relieve the burden on the conservatives who aren't anonymous, it would be helpful for you to be not anonymous. I
mm,
think if you sign your name to things, um, in general, and this isn't always true because we all know people who, including me, who sign their names to things and just get in a fit and write crazy stuff. But it generally makes people more circumspect about what they're saying,
mm,
about what they're sharing.
mm,
Um, I don't think anonymity is 100% a bad idea. I would look at, I mean, for all the awfulness that goes on over at 4chan, um, they were fantastic at identifying a guy, an Antifa guy who bombed a building the other day, because they crowdsourced it. They
mm,
put up a picture of the guy, and he was wearing a vest. So somebody searched the vest on Amazon and found a review that said, I bought this for my grandson to wear at protests. And that's how they figured out who the guy was who bombed the building. And
mm,
although all those people are anonymous and half of them are probably nuts, so that's unfortunate, but there are amazingly tiny micro instances where I understand anonymity. But if all you're doing is retweeting an article you like, or whatever, I would say use your name or get off the internet. I
mm.
mean, it's not that hard. No one is making you be on Twitter. No one is making you be on Facebook. And I'll be brutally honest with you, your opinion maybe isn't that original or insightful or um, even spelled correctly. So it's not going to be any great loss. You're not Thomas Paine,
Mm,
okay? Get a
mm,
grip on yourself. All the anonymous bros out there with their little crusader avatars and their little anonymous names that are always like Road Warrior X29. Come on, just
mm,
stop.
mm.
This whole LARPing of the revolution is
Yeah.
is very sad. I think it's a waste of energy. So it would waste less energy if everybody used their own names. It would take the burden off the 50 or 100 or whatever people out there who do use their real names.
Hmm.
And you know, I don't really see a downside. I'm sorry, if you're afraid of losing your job, the answer is just don't go on Twitter.
Mm. Well,
No one, you don't
ye-
have to.
yeah, well, I'm divided on this. And it would be hypocritical of me not to admit that I have self-censored, out of concern of blowback. And in fact, I have faced business consequences because of the things I have written that shouldn't really be that controversial. I'll give one example. Um, I put out some Facebook posts in support of the Canadian oil industry at a time when it was tanking thanks to protests. This was actually pre-COVID. And thanks to those tweets and some other or Facebook messages and some other bits and pieces cobbled together that, you know, anyways, the long story short is, I've lost at least one contract in recent times and probably more that I don't even know about. So a few other thoughts about this, because I've been dealing with it personally. Um, Brett Weinstein, who is no one's idea of a conservative. In fact, he's often said he would like to live in a society where he could be conservative because it was just so good. He would want to preserve everything. Um, he's talked about how those who step aside and silence themselves and don't speak out are not. They may have very good reasons for doing so, and they may be in circumstances where they know if they say something, they're fired, and that's not a small thing. But at the same time, they are essentially letting other people fight their battles. They're putting the burden onto others,
Right.
it's also akin to that the position of a. It's not quite analogous, but I think of, say, a conscientious objector to a war who, that's not entirely a moral position. You would think you might think it is on its face. Oh, I'm not going to commit violence against my fellow human beings. But if you're in a society that is threatened by dangers of the military sort, all you're doing is putting the burden onto your fellow citizens to take a bullet or to kill instead of you.
Well,
Um,
yeah, I mean, that was Robert Kennedy's point in a
mm,
really good speech to a bunch of college students. He
mm,
said, oh, you're all fans of mine, but how many of you are draft dodgers, or how many of you did XYZ to get out of the draft?
mm,
Do you realize that because you did that, more blacks, more poor whites in the South are the ones that are being shipped overseas?
mm,
So think about it.
mm, mm,
See, like, okay, so your point was that you said something and then there were consequences, and I agree that those consequences are absurd and totally shitty. But my objection is that the people who are anonymous because of things that happened to you
mm,
are it's well, now they get to all happen to you. You know,
mhm,
they're never going to happen to them because they're anonymous.
right.
So I would say you can't be brave and a coward at the same time.
Mm,
So, pick one. You
mm,
know, don't say crazy stuff on Twitter or controversial stuff on Twitter or whatever, but hide behind a name,
mm,
because then Jonathon Narvey is the one who's going to get in trouble.
Right.
It's cowardice. So
Mm,
post recipes or cute dog pictures or something,
mm,
but it when it comes to things like politics, unless there's a name behind it, I can't take it seriously. And I go, pretty far with that. There was a great essay, the Flight 93 election, the 2016 essay that guy wrote. Great essay, but I never linked to it because the guy at the time didn't put his name to it. It was only when he became really famous that he sort of came out of the closet.
mm-hmm.
And I just, when he had some signature at some magazine or whatever, then it was safe for him to come out. And, like fine prose is no excuse, no matter how beautiful something is, if it's anonymous, it's just hard for me to uh, get behind. And, you have a choice. You don't have to give your opinion on social media unless you're prepared to put your name on it. It would spread the burden, as that guy was saying. So, and I say that as somebody who's always, like I said, put their name on things. So of course I'm biased, but I've seen that it works. Yes, have I lost jobs, as you insightfully said, jobs I never knew I lost,
Mm,
probably, but I'm also very gainfully employed. There
mm-hmm.
are other things out there that a person can do. And so I don't know. You have to make a choice. And I think straddling the line between being this sort of bellicose keyboard warrior, but doing it with a fake name is just totally unfair. And it just gluts the whole discourse anyway.
Mm, mm. Well, is it? I don't want to finish maybe on such a gloomy note. Did you have a bit of advice then for those who, um, well, okay, what would be either on an individual level or a collective level? What's the thing to do? I guess, well, aside from just stop being anonymous and don't say completely stupid stuff. I don't want to suggest how will I put this? I you can't defend yourself against a dishonest critic, and there are some people who will go after you no matter how reasonable your position is. They will just infer whatever insane meaning into what you've said. But I guess the idea is just be smarter about what we're saying. Given that uh, there's such a domination of the culture from a certain side. Um, you know what? I guess my question is bigger than that. Is it possible to change that state of being of the left just owning essentially all the means of production when it comes to the culture?
Um, I'm really not that optimistic about it. I think we
Mm,
had a chance 15 years ago to construct a conservative or libertarian, whatever you want to call it, uh, social media infrastructure, and all that money was turned into, as I said, vanity websites, unnecessary news aggregators. People poured tons of money into think tanks
mm,
that are basically a waste of time. Um, and so I think we might have missed a way of doing that. It looks like the only thing that's going to work is some kind of trust busting thing, which I have mixed feelings about when
mm,
it comes to social media.
mm,
Um, and I don't know. I think a lot of conservatives are just kind of wimpy, disguised as I'm busy working for a living. But basically they aren't quite as motivated. They're hoping somebody else will do something. Um, there's a kind of a apathy, and again, I think that screaming crazy stuff or even
mm,
intelligent stuff online anonymously is just another bit of energy that could have been used. If
mm,
we could have harnessed all that and put it into something fruitful and positive, then we'd be in a better position today.
Mm, mm,
So I don't know. I'm not really that convinced. It's uh, I think that the right is probably always going to be kind of fringy, because the cycle seems to be leftists say crazy stuff, pass stupid laws, come around 25 years later to realizing, oh, you know what? After all, that was kind of stupid. Conservatives who are still alive go, yeah, we told you. And then the whole thing starts all over again. So, yeah. So
okay.
I don't really know.
Well,
If people can Google this, but there's a famous article, I think, at the New Yorker called um, Dan Quayle Was Right. And it's
mm,
about how, Dan Quayle, everybody and their grandma laughed at Dan Quayle, the vice president, for saying that Murphy Brown, the TV sitcom, was a bad influence on women. And so, 20 years later, somebody rather high up said, you know what, Dan Quayle was right, telling women that when they're middle-aged, they should just get their eggs unfrozen and have some kid without a guy, and da da da, especially when the character is like this wealthy TV anchor woman, da da da. How many lives were probably wrecked by some not very bright person saying, well, I saw it on TV, it was on Murphy Brown, single moms are cool. And so it's a wonderful article, but it's sort of like, well, thanks for coming out. Like, we told you this, you made fun of us. Now you're apologizing. You see it all the time with the Ronald Reagan. Was he so bad?
mm,
George W. Bush. Remember him?
mm,
I never thought I'd miss George, but though it's a cycle. So
mm,
I think that unfortunately, we have to kind of keep fighting, but I don't know if you ever win, especially the way that things are just set up these days.
mm.
Everybody said, oh, kids these days, all their PC stuff, but when they get out into the workforce, boy, are they going to learn a lesson. Well, the workforce is college now. HR departments are college.
Mm,
All those people who you said were going to learn a lesson are running the companies and think all this stuff is great. So,
mm,
you know, uh, sometimes I think conservatives speak in these cliches like, well, when they get out in the real world and they're unexamined. And that's another thing I think that conservatives have a bad, is holding them back, is the unspoken kind of cliches that we all throw around with each
mm,
other
mm.
are not um, helping our thinking and our discourse evolve. I'm glad Ronald Reagan said something in 1987 or whatever, but we have to move beyond that. I had a big thing on Steyn in the comments about the happy warrior thing. Oh, I'm a happy warrior, and it's easy for Rush Limbaugh to be a happy warrior when he makes $30 million a year and has never been sued that I'm aware of. So the burden of conservatives should not only be warriors, we should be happy warriors, is a burden that is just too much to place on people. And I think with the death of Mike Adams, we see that this is a dangerous thing that we should be aspiring to. But, and until conservatives stop speaking in cliches and thinking in cliches, I don't think we're going to get very far. We're just
Mm.
talking to each other.
Well, on that bright note,
Ah, ha, ha.
we've been talking about the future of culture and politics, and I'm so glad that after getting through about probably 45 minutes of preamble, we did manage to get to talk about the future, even if the future doesn't look so gloomy for one side. So, well, maybe things will have changed.
You never know.
Yes, yes. By our next conversation, which I look forward to.
Me too.
I'm the host of The Future of, Jonathon Narvey, and I have been speaking with Kathy Shaidle, the movie columnist over at Steyn Online. And again, can you remind our listeners where they can find you?
Yeah, if you go to steynonline.com every Saturday, I have a new movie column up. It's not really a review often so much as a kind of deep dive and look back and putting the movie of whatever era, often very old ones, into some kind of historical context, giving you background information, and just trying to get people. It's hard sometimes to get conservatives to watch anything that doesn't have car chases in it, but I do my best over there.
Okay, well, I appreciate your columns, and I read them all. So thank you very
Thank
much
you.
for your time, and
Thank you.
you have a great day.
You too. Thank you.